Welcome back to bedtime. Tonight, we're reading a short collection of classic sci-fi stories, starting with this one. Let's get straight into it. Glowworm by Harlan, Ellison. When the sun sank behind the blasted horizon, its glare blotted out by the twisted wreckage rising obscenely against the hills, Seligman continued to glow. He shone with a steady off-green aura that surrounded his body, radiated from the tips of his hair, crawled from his skin, and lit his way in the darkest night. It had been with him for 2 years now. Though Seligman had never been a melodramatic man, he had more than once rolled the phrase through his mind, letting it fall from his lips. "I'm a freak." Which was not entirely true. There was no longer anyone he might have termed normal for his comparison. Not only were there no men, there was no more life of any kind. The silence was broken only by the searching wind, picking its way cautiously between the slow, rusting girders of a dead past. Even as he said, freak, his mind washed the word with 2 waves, almost as one. Vindictiveness and a resignation inextricably bound in self-pity, hopelessness, and hatred. They were at fault, he screamed at the tortured piles of masonry in his path. Across the viewer of his mind, thoughts twisted nimbly, knowing the route, having traversed it often before. Man had reached for the stars, finding them within his reach, were he willing to give up his ancestral home. Those who had wanted space more than one planet had gone out past the edge, into the wilderness of no return. It would take years to get there, and the journey back was an unthinkable one. Time had set its seal upon them. Go if you must, but don't look behind you. So they had gone. They had left the steam of Venus, the grit wind of Mars, the ice of Pluto, the sun-bake of Mercury. There had been no Earthmen left in the system of Sol, except, of course, on Earth, which had been left to madmen. And they had been too busy throwing things at each other to worry about the stars. The men who knew no other answer stayed and fought. They were the ones who fathered the Attilas, the Genghis Khans, the Hitlers. They were the ones who pushed the buttons and launched the missiles that chased each other across the skies, fell like downed birds, exploded, blasted, cratered, chewed out and carved out the face of the planet. They were also the little men who had failed to resist, even as they had failed to look up at the night sky. They were the ones who had destroyed the Earth. Now no one was left. No man. Just Seligman. And he glowed. They were at fault, he screamed again, and the sound was a lost thing in the night. His mind carried him back through the years to the days near the end of what had to be the last war, because there would be no one left to fight another. He was carried back again to the sterile white rooms where the searching instruments, the prying needles, the clucking scientists all labored over him and his group. They were to be a last-ditch throwaway. They were the indestructible men, a new breed of soldier, able to live through the searing heat of the bombs, to walk unaffected through the purgatory hail of radiation, to assault where ordinary men would have collapsed long before. Seligman picked his way over the rubble, his aura casting the faintest phosphorescence over the ruptured metal and plastic shreds. He paused momentarily, eyeing the blasted remnants of a fence to which clung a sign, held to the twined metal by one rusting bolt. Newark Spaceport. Entrance by authorization only. Shards of metal scrap moved under his bare feet, their razored edges rasping against the flesh, yet causing no break in the skin. Another product of the sterile white rooms and the strangely hued fluids injected into his body? 23 young men, routine volunteers as fit as the era of war could produce, had been moved to the solitary block building in Salt Lake City. It was a cubed structure with no windows and only one door, guarded night and day. If nothing else, they had security. No one knew the intensive experimentation going on inside those steel-enforced concrete walls, even the men upon whose bodies the experiments were being performed. It was because of those experiments performed on him that Seligman was here now, alone. Because of the myopic little men with their foreign accents and their clippings of skin from his buttocks and shoulders, the bacteriologists and the endocrine specialists, the epidermis men and the bloodstream inspectors. Because of all of them, he was here now, when no one else had lived. Seligman rubbed his forehead at the base of the hairline. Why had he lived? Was it some strain of rare origin running through his body that had allowed him to stand the effects of the bombs? Was it a combination of the experiments performed on him, and only in a certain way on him, for none of the other 22 had lived, and the radiation? He gave up for the millionth time. Had he been a student of the ills of man, he might have ventured a guess, but it was too far afield for a common foot soldier. All that counted was that when he had awakened, pinned thighs, chest, and arms under the masonry of a building in Salt Lake City, he was alive and could see. He could see, that is, till the tears clouded the vision of his own sick green glow. It was life, but at times like this, with the flickering light of his passage marked on the ash-littered remains of his culture, he wondered if it was worth the agony. He never really approached madness, for the shock of realizing he was totally and finally alone, without a voice or a face or a touch in all the world, overrode the smaller shock of his transformation. He lived. He was that fabled, joked-about last man on Earth. But it wasn't a joke now. Nor had the months after the final dust of extinction settled across the planet been a joke. Those months had labored past as he searched the country, taking what little food was still sealed from radiation, though why radiation should bother him he could not imagine, habit more than anything, and disease, racing from one end of the continent in search of but one other human to share his torment. But of course, there had been no one. He was cut off, like a withered arm from the body that was his race. Not only was he alone, and with the double terror of an aura that never dimmed, sending the word freak pounding through his mind, but there were other changes, equally terrifying. It had been in Philadelphia, while grubbing inside a broken store window, that he had discovered another symptom of his change. The jagged glass pane had ripped the shirt through to his skin, but had not damaged him. The flesh showed white momentarily, and then even that faded. Seligman experimented cautiously, then recklessly, and found that the radiations, or his treatments, or both, had indeed changed him. He was completely impervious to harm of a minor sort. Fire in small amounts did not bother him. Sharp edges could no more rip his flesh than they could a piece of treated steel. Work produced no calluses. He was, in a limited sense of the word, invulnerable. The indestructible man had been created too late. Too late to bring satisfaction to the myopic butchers who had puttered unceasingly about his body. Perhaps had they managed to survive, they might still not comprehend what had occurred. It was too much like the product of a wild coincidence. But that had not lessened his agony. loneliness can be a powerful thing, more consuming than hatred, more demanding than mother love, more driving than ambition. It could, in fact, drive a man to the stars. Perhaps it had been a communal yearning within his glowing breast, perhaps a sense of the dramatic or a last vestige of that unconscious debt all men owe to their kind. Perhaps it was simply an urge to talk to someone. Seligman summed it up without soul-searching in the philosophy, I can't be any worse off than I am now, so why not? It didn't matter, really. Whatever the reason, he knew by the time his search was over that he must seek men out, wherever in the stars they might be, and tell them he must be a messenger of death to his kin beyond the earth. They would mourn little, he knew, but he still had to tell them. He would have to go after them and say, "Your fathers are gone. Your home is no more. They played the last hand of that most dangerous of games, and lost. The earth is dead." He smiled a tight, grim smile, as he thought, at least I won't have to carry a lantern to them. They'll see me coming by my own glow. Glow, little glowworm. Glimmer, glimmer. Seligman threaded his way through the tortured wreckage and crumpled metalwork of what had been a towering structure of shining planed glass and steel and plastic. Even though he knew he was alone, Seligman turned and looked back over his shoulder, sensing he was being watched. He had had that feeling many times, and he knew it for what it was. It was death, standing straddle-legged over the face of the land, casting shadow and eternal silence upon it. The only light came from the lone man stalking toward the rocket, standing sentry like a pillar of January ice in the center of the blast area. His fingers twitched as he thought of the 2 years' work that had gone into erecting that shaft of beryllium. Innumerable painstaking trips to and from the junk heaps of that field, pirating pieces from other ships, liberating cases of parts from bombed-out storage sheds, relentlessly forcing himself on even when exhaustion cried its claim. Seligman had not been a scientist or a mechanic, but determination, texts on rocket motors, and the original miracle of finding an only partially destroyed ship with its drive still intact had provided him with a means to leave this place of death. It was one of the latest model ships, a Smith-class cruiser with conning bubbles set far back on the tapered nose, and the ugly black depressions behind which the Bergsill cannons rested on movable tracks. He climbed the hull ladder into the open inspection hatch, finding his way easily, even without a torch. His fingers began running over the complicated leads of the drive components, checking and rechecking what he already knew was sound and foolproof, or as foolproof as an amateur could make them. Now that it was ready, and all that remained were these routine check tests and loading the food for the journey, he found himself more terrified of leaving than of remaining alone till he died. And when that might be, with his stamina, he had no idea. How would they receive a man as transformed as he? Would they not instinctively fear, mistrust, despise him? Am I stalling? The question suddenly formed in his mind, causing his shore inspection to falter. Had he been purposely putting the takeoff date further and further ahead, using the checks and other tasks as further attempts to stall? His head began to ache with the turmoil of his thoughts. Then he shook himself in disgust. The tests were necessary. It was stressed repeatedly in all of the texts lying about the floor of the drive chamber. His hands shook, but that same impetus which had carried him for 2 years forced him to complete the checkups. Just as dawn oozed up over the outline of the tatters that had been New York, he finished his work on the ship. Without pause, sensing he must race not with time but with the doubts raging inside him, he climbed back down the ladder and began loading food boxes. They were stacked neatly to one side of a hand-powered lift he had restored. The hard rubber containers of concentrates and the bulbs of carefully sought-out liquids made an imposing and somewhat perplexing sight. Food is the main problem, he told himself. If I should get past a point of no return and find my food giving out, my chances would be nil. I'll have to wait until I can find more stores of food. He estimated the time needed for the search and realized it might be months, perhaps even another year, till he had accrued enough from the wasted stores within any conceivable distance. In fact, finding a meal in the city after he had carted box after box of edibles out to the rocket had become an increasingly more difficult job. Further, he suddenly realized that he had not eaten since the day before. The day before, he'd been so engrossed in the final touches of the ship, he had completely neglected to eat. Well, it had happened before, even before the blast. With an effort, he began to grope back, trying to remember the last time he had eaten. Then it became quite clear to him. It leaped out and dissolved away all the delays he had been contriving. He had not eaten in 3 weeks. Seligman had known it, of course, but it had been buried so deeply that he only half feared it. He had tried to deny the truth, for when that last seemingly insurmountable problem was removed, there was nothing but his own inadequacies to prevent his leaving. Now it came out, full bloom. The treatments and radiation had done more than make him merely impervious to mild perils. He no longer needed to eat. He boggled at the concept for a moment, shaken by the realization that he had not recognized the fact before. He had heard of anaerobic bacteria or yeasts that could derive their energy from other sources without the normal oxidation of foods. Bringing the impossible to relatively homely terms made it easier for him to accept. Maybe it was even possible to absorb energy directly. At least he felt no slightest twinge of hunger, even after 3 weeks of back-breaking work without eating. Probably he would have to take along a certain amount of proteins to replenish the body tissue he expended, but as for the bulky boxes of edibles dotting the space around the ship, most were no longer a necessity. Now that he had faced up to the idea that he had been delaying through a fear of the trip itself, and that there was nothing left to stop his leaving almost immediately, Seligman again found himself caught up in the old drive. He was suddenly intent on getting the ship into the air and beyond. Dusk mingled with the blotching of the sun before Seligman was ready. It had not been stalling this time, however. The sorting and packing of needed proteins took time. But now he was ready. There was nothing to keep him on Earth. He took one last look around. It seemed the thing to do. Sentimentalism was not one of Seligman's more outstanding traits, but he did it in preparation for anyone who might ask him, what did it look like at the end? It was with a twinge of regret that he had brought the facts to mind. He had never really looked at his sterile world in the 2 years he had been preparing to leave it. One became accustomed to living in a pile of rubble, and after a bit it no longer offered even the feel of an environment. He climbed the ladder into the ship, carefully closing and dogging the port behind him. The chair was ready, webbing flattened back against the deep rubber pile of its seat and backrest. He slid into it and swung the control box down on its ball swivel to a position before his face. He drew the top webbing across himself and snapped its triple lock clamps into place. Seligman sat in the ship he had not even bothered to name, fingers groping for the actuator button on the arm of the chair, glowing all the while, weirdly, in the half-light of the cavern. So, this was to be the last picture he might carry with him to the heavens, a bitter epitaph to erase misspent. No warning. It was too late for such puny action. All was dead and haunted on the face of the earth. No blade of grass dared rise. No small life murmured in its burrows and caves in the oddly dusty skies, or for all he knew, to the very bottom of the Cayman Trench. There was only silence. The silence of a graveyard. He pushed the button. The ship began to rise, waveringly. There was a total lack of the grandeur he remembered when the others had left. The ship sputtered and coughed brokenly as it climbed on its imperfect drive. Tremors shook the cavern, and Seligman could feel something wrong vibrating through the chair and floor into his body. Its flames were not so bright or steady as those other takeoffs, but it continued to rise and gather speed. The hull began to glow as the rocket lifted higher into the dust-filled sky. Acceleration pressed down on Seligman, though not as much as he had expected. It was merely uncomfortable, not punishing. Then he remembered that he was not of the same stamp as those who had preceded him. His ship continued to pull itself up out of the Earth's atmosphere. The hull oranged, then turned cherry, then straw yellow as the coolers within its skin fought to counteract the blasting fury. Again and again, Seligman could feel the wrongness of the climb. Something was going to give. As the bulkheads to his right began to strain and buckle, he knew what it was. The ship had not been built or re-welded by trained experts working in teams with the latest equipment. He had been one lone, determined man, with only book experience to back him. Now, his errors were about to tell. The ship passed beyond the atmosphere, and Seligman stared in horror as the plates cracked and shattered outwards. He tried to scream as the air shrieked outwards, but it was already impossible. Then he fainted. When the ship passed the moon, Seligman sat still, his body held in place by the now constricted webbing, facing the gaping squares and sundered metal that had been the cabin wall. Abruptly, the engines cut off. As though it were a signal, Seligman's eyes fluttered and opened wide. He stared at the wall, his reviving brain grasping the final truth. The last vestige of humanity had been clawed from him. He no longer needed air to live. His throat constricted, his belly knotted, and the blood that should theoretically be boiling pounded thickly in his throat. His last kinship with those he was searching was gone. If he had been a freak before, what was he now? The turmoil fought itself out in him as the ship sped onward, and he faced what he had become, what he must do. He was more than a messenger now. He was a shining symbol of the end of all humanity on Earth, a symbol of the evil their kind had done. The men out there would never treasure him, welcome him, or build proud legends around him, but they could never deny him. He was a messenger from the grave. They would see him in the airless cabin even before he landed. They would never be able to live with him, but they would have to listen to him and to believe. Seligman sat in the crash chair in the cabin that was dark except for the eerie glow that was part of him. He sat there, lonely and eternally alone, and slowly a grim smile grew on his lips. The bitter purpose that had been forced on him was finally clear. For 2 years, he had fought to find an escape from the death and loneliness of ruined Earth. Now that was impossible. One Seligman was enough. Alone? He hadn't known the meaning of the word before. It would be his job to make sure that he was alone among his people, until the end of time. A Little Journey by Bradbury. There were two important things. One, that she was very old. Two, that Mr. Thurkell was taking her to God. For hadn't he patted her hand and said, "Mrs. Bellows will take off into space in my rocket and go to find him together"? And that was how it was going to be. This wasn't like any other group Mrs. Bellows had ever joined. In her fervor to light a path for her delicate, tottering feet, she had struck matches down dark alleys and found her way to Hindu mystics who floated their flickering, starry eyelashes over crystal balls. She had walked on the meadow paths with ascetic Indian philosophers imported by daughters in spirit of Madame Blavatsky. She had made pilgrimages to California's stucco jungles to hunt the astrological seer in his natural habitat. She had even consented to signing away the rights to one of her homes in order to be taken into the shouting order of a temple of amazing evangelists who had promised her golden smoke, crystal fire, and the great, soft hand of God coming to bear her home. None of these people had ever shaken Mrs. Bellows' faith, even when she saw them sirened away in a black wagon in the night, or discovered their pictures bleak and unromantic in the morning tabloids. The world had roughed them up and locked them away because they knew too much. That was all. And then, 2 weeks ago, she had seen Mr. Thurkell's advertisement in New York City. Come to Mars. Stay at the Thurkell Restorium for 1 week, and then on into space on the greatest adventure life can offer. Send for free pamphlet. Nearer, my God, to thee. Excursion rates, round trip, slightly lower. Round trip, Mrs. Bellows had thought. But who would come back after seeing him? And so, she had bought a ticket and flown off to Mars and spent 7 mild days at Mr. Thurkell's Restorium, the building with the sign on it which flashed, "Thurkell's Rocket to Heaven." She had spent the week bathing in limpid waters and erasing the care from her tiny bones. And now, she was fidgeting, ready to be loaded into Mr. Thurkell's own special private rocket, like a bullet, to be fired on out into space beyond Jupiter and Saturn and Pluto. And thus, who could deny it, you would be getting nearer and nearer to the Lord. How wonderful. Couldn't you just feel him drawing near? Couldn't you just sense his breath, his scrutiny, his presence? "Here I am," said Mrs. Bellows. "An ancient rickety elevator ready to go up the shaft. God need only press the button." Now, on the 7th day, as she minced up the steps of the Restorium, a number of small doubts assailed her. "For one thing," she said aloud to no one, "it isn't quite the land of milk and honey here on Mars that they said it would be. My room is like a cell. The swimming pool is really quite inadequate, and besides, how many windows who look like mushrooms or skeletons want to swim? And finally, the whole Restorium smells of boiled cabbage and tennis shoes." She opened the front door and let it slam, somewhat irritably. She was amazed at the other women in the auditorium. It was like wandering in a carnival mirror maze, coming again and again upon yourself, the same flowery face, the same chicken hands and jingling bracelets. One after another of the images of herself floated before her. She put out her hand, but it wasn't a mirror. It was another lady shaking her fingers and saying, "We're waiting for Mr. Thurkle. Shush." "Ah," whispered everyone. The velvet curtains parted. Mr. Thurkle appeared, fantastically serene, his Egyptian eyes upon everyone. But there was something nevertheless in his appearance which made one expect him to call, "Hi!" while fuzzy dogs jumped over his legs, through his hooped arms and over his back. Then, dogs and all, he should dance with a dazzling piano keyboard smile off into the wings. Mrs. Bellows, with a secret part of her mind which she constantly had to grip tightly, expected to hear a cheap Chinese gong sound when Mr. Thurkle entered. His large, liquid, dark eyes were so improbable that one of the old ladies had facetiously claimed she saw a mosquito cloud hovering over them, as they did around summer rain barrels, and Mrs. Bellows sometimes caught the scent of the theatrical mothball and the smell of Calliope steam on his sharply pressed suit. But with the same savage rationalization that had greeted all other disappointments in her rickety life, she bit at the suspicion and whispered, "This time it's real. This time it'll work. Haven't we got a rocket?" Mr. Thurkle bowed. He smiled a sudden comedy mask smile. The old ladies looked in at his epiglottis and sensed chaos there. Before he even began to speak, Mrs. Bellows saw him picking up each of his words, oiling it, making sure it ran smooth on its rails. Her heart squeezed in like a tiny fist, and she gritted her porcelain teeth. "Friends," said Mr. Thurkle, and you could hear the frost snap in the hearts of the entire assemblage. "No," said Mrs. Bellows ahead of time. She could hear the bad news rushing at her, and herself tied to the track while the immense black wheels threatened and the whistle screamed helpless. "There will be a slight delay," said Mr. Thurkle. In the next instant, Mr. Thurkle might have cried or been tempted to cry, "Ladies, be seated," in minstrel fashion, for the ladies had come up at him from their chairs protesting and trembling. Not a very long delay. Mr. Thurkle put his hands up to pat the air. "How long?" "Only a week." "A week?" "Yes, you can stay here at the Restorium for 7 more days, can't you? A little delay won't matter, will it, in the end? You've waited a lifetime. Only a few more days." "At $20 a day," thought Mrs. Bellows coldly. "What's the trouble?" a woman cried. "A legal difficulty," said Mr. Thurkle. "We've a rocket, haven't we?" "Well, yes, but I've been here a whole month waiting," said one old lady. "Delays, delays." "That's right," said everyone. "Ladies, ladies," murmured Mr. Thurkle, smiling serenely. "We want to see the rocket." It was Mrs. Bellows forging ahead. Alone, brandishing her fist like a toy hammer, Mr. Thurkle looked into the old lady's eyes, a missionary among albino cannibals. "Well, now," he said. "Yes, now," cried Mrs. Bellows. "I'm afraid," he began. "So am I," she said. "That's why we want to see this ship." No, Mrs. He snapped his fingers for her name. "Bellows," she cried. She was a small container, but now all the seething pressures that had been built up over long years came streaming through the delicate vents of her body. Her cheeks became incandescent. With a wail that was like a melancholy factory whistle, Mrs. Bellows ran forward and hung to him almost by her teeth like a summer-maddened Spitz. She would not and never could let go until he died, and the other women followed, jumping and yapping, like a pound let loose on its trainer, the same one who had patted them, and to whom they had squirmed and whined joyfully an hour before, now milling about him, creasing his sleeves and frightening the Egyptian serenity from his gaze. "This way!" cried Mrs. Bellows, feeling like Madame Lafarge. "Through the back. We've waited long enough to see the ship. Every day he's put us off, every day we've waited. Now, let's see." "No, ladies!" cried Mr. Thurgle, leaping about. They burst through the back of the stage and out a door like a flood, bearing the poor man with them into a shed and then out, quite suddenly, into an abandoned gymnasium. "There it is," said someone. "The rocket!" And then a silence fell that was terrible to entertain. There was the rocket. Mrs. Bellows looked at it, and her hands sagged away from Mr. Thurgle's collar. The rocket was something like a battered copper pot. There were 1,000 bulges and rents and rusty pipes and dirty vents on and in it. The ports were clouded over with dust, resembling the eyes of a blind hog. Everyone wailed a little sighing wail. "Is that the rocket ship Glory Be to the Highest?" cried Mrs. Bellows, appalled. Mr. Thurgle nodded and looked at his feet. "For which we paid out our $1,000 apiece and came all the way to Mars to get on board with you and go off to find him?" asked Mrs. Bellows. "Why, that isn't worth a sack of dried peas," said Mrs. Bellows. "It's nothing but junk." "Junk?" whispered everyone, getting hysterical. "Don't let him get away!" Mr. Thurgle tried to break and run, but 1,000 possum traps closed on him from every side. He withered. Everybody walked around in circles like blind mice. There was a confusion and a weeping that lasted for 5 minutes as they went over and touched the rocket, the dented kettle, the rusty container for God's children. "Well," said Mrs. Bellows. She stepped up into the askew doorway of the rocket and faced everyone. "It looks as if a terrible thing has been done to us," she said. "I haven't any money to go back home to Earth, and I've too much pride to go to the government and tell them a common man like this has fooled us out of our life savings. I don't know how you feel about it, all of you, but the reason all of us came is because I'm 85 and you're 89 and you're 78, and all of us are nudging on toward 100, and there's nothing on Earth for us. And it doesn't appear there's anything on Mars either. We all expected not to breathe much more air or crochet many more doilies, or we'd never have come here. So what I have to propose is a simple thing. To take a chance." She reached out and touched the rusted hulk of the rocket. "This is our rocket. We paid for our trip, and we're going to take our trip." Mr. Thurgle began to cry. He did it quite easily and very effectively. "We're going to get in this ship," said Mrs. Bellows, ignoring him, "and we're going to take off to where we were going." Mr. Thurgle stopped crying long enough to say, "But it was all a fake. I don't know anything about space. He's not out there anyway. I lied. I don't know where he is, and I couldn't find him if I wanted to. And you were fools to ever take my word on it." "Yes," said Mrs. Bellows. "We were fools. I'll go along on that. But you can't blame us for we're old. And it was a lovely, good and fine idea. One of the loveliest ideas in the world. Oh, we didn't really fool ourselves that we could get nearer to him physically. It was the gentle, mad dream of old people, the kind of thing you hold on to for a few minutes a day, even though you know it's not true. So, all of you who want to go, you follow me in the ship." "But you can't go," said Mr. Thurkle. "You haven't got a navigator, and that ship's a ruin." "You," said Mrs. Bellows, "will be the navigator." She stepped into the ship, and after a moment, the other old ladies pressed forward. Mr. Thurkle, windmilling his arms frantically, was nevertheless pressed through the port, and in a minute, the door slammed shut. Mr. Thurkle was strapped into the navigator's seat, with everyone talking at once and holding him down. The special helmets were issued to be fitted over every grey or white head to supply extra oxygen in case of a leakage in the ship's hull. And at long last, the hour had come, and Mrs. Bellows stood behind Mr. Thurkle and said, "We're ready, sir." He said nothing. He pleaded with them silently, using his great, dark, wet eyes, but Mrs. Bellows shook her head and pointed to the control. "Take off," agreed Mr. Thurkle morosely, and pulled a switch. Everybody fell. The rocket went up from the planet Mars in a great fiery glide, with the noise of an entire kitchen thrown down an elevator shaft, with a sound of pots and pans and kettles and fires boiling and stews bubbling, with a smell of burned incense and rubber and sulfur, with a color of yellow fire, and a ribbon of red stretching below them, and all the old women singing and holding to each other, and Mrs. Bellows crawling upright in the sighing, straining, trembling ship. "Head for space, Mr. Thurkle." "It can't last," said Mr. Thurkle sadly. "This ship can't last. It will..." It did. The rocket exploded. Mrs. Bellows felt herself lifted and thrown about dizzily like a doll. She heard the great screamings and saw the flashes of bodies sailing by her in fragments of metal and powdery light. "Help! Help!" cried Mr. Thurkle far away on a small radio beam. The ship disintegrated into 1,000,000 parts, and the old ladies, all 100 of them, were flung straight on ahead with the same velocity as the ship. As for Mr. Thurkle, for some reason of trajectory perhaps, he had been blown out the other side of the ship. Mr. Bellows saw him falling separate and away from them, screaming. "There goes Mr. Thurkle," thought Mrs. Bellows, and she knew where he was going. He was going to be burned and roasted and broiled good, but very good. Mr. Thurkle was falling down into the sun. "And here we are," thought Mrs. Bellows. "Here we are, going on out and out and out." There was hardly a sense of motion at all, but she knew that she was traveling at 50,000 miles an hour and would continue to travel at that speed for an eternity, until she saw the other women swinging all about her in their own trajectories, a few minutes of oxygen left to each of them in their helmets, and each was looking up to where they were going. Of course, thought Mrs. Bellows, out into space, out, and the darkness like a great church and the stars like candles. And in spite of everything, Mr. Thurkle, the rocket, and the dishonesty, we are going toward the Lord. And there, yes, there, as she fell on and on, coming toward her, she could almost discern the outline now. Coming toward her was his mighty golden hand, reaching down to hold her and comfort her like a frightened sparrow. "I'm Mrs. Amelia Bellows," she said quietly in her best company voice. "I'm from planet Earth.